Welcome to Paranormal or Reality. This week we discover a spirit on a Greyhound bus, the ghost of teenage boys at the bus stop, and the in-depth story of the red-eyed demon. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Also, if you have any stories you would like to share, I have my email information in the description below. Now let's begin. So last month I was traveling, and I decided to come back on a Greyhound-type bus. Where it travels to other states, I hope I described it well. It was apparently a luxury bus. Anyways, it was the second day of being on the bus when I was getting ready to sleep. It was a long drive, and we were still in the middle of the desert. I know how the passengers look and where they were sitting, so here's what happened. I dozed off and went to sleep. When I woke up, I see this little girl with glasses, blonde hair. It looked like a younger version of one of my friends. She wasn't one of the passengers I remember. She was peeking her head from the seat in front of me and was looking at the windows outside. Then she lowered her head back down. I decide to go back to sleep. A few hours, the bus suddenly stops for a restaurant break so that we can eat. As I look around the restaurant, I didn't see the little girl I saw anywhere. When we got back on the bus, I looked around for the girl, but once again I didn't see her. I remember the only person sitting in front of me was an older man. I asked him if he saw any young children on the bus. He said, no, he didn't. Then I asked the driver if we made any other pickup stops. He looked at me and said that we hadn't stopped anywhere for 6 hours. I'm convinced I saw a spirit that night. I never saw her again on the bus. At the time, I did not have my own car. Besides getting rides from friends, I mostly had to take the bus to get to work. The bus stop I had to walk to was pretty far away from my apartment complex. There was a lot of new construction everywhere on that road in front of the complex, but there was a gas station. Also a very small shopping plaza that was mostly empty except for a bank and little mom-and-pop grocery store. I used to sometimes stop at this grocery store to get some Starbucks iced coffee before walking to the bus stop. On one very early morning, I want to say it was around 5:30 a.m., I was walking to the bus stop. I know this is bad for a girl to walk alone this early. I also had my earbuds in and was just walking along, not really paying attention to my surroundings. Suddenly, I got a very cold chill that went up and down my spine. I got the distinct feeling someone was walking behind me. I turned around and obviously no one was there. I got a little nervous, so I left one of my earbuds out just to keep myself a little more alert. I continued walking and was almost to the shopping plaza when I hear running footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, but I continued to hear the footsteps getting closer. As I stood there frozen in fear, I could not move any further. I then heard something rustle in the bushes next to the sidewalk right next to me. Then all of a sudden, the footsteps stop. I caught my breath for a few seconds. For some reason, the energy I felt was not a positive one. So I decided to sprint to the little grocery store in the plaza. I calmed myself down long enough to walk over to buy what I needed. Then I realized I had only 7 to 8 minutes to get to the bus stop. As I near the door to leave the store, I see as clear as day a figure of a man that seemed like he was standing in his own fog, standing in the middle of the parking lot. I honestly could not tell any of his features, but as soon as he seemed to realize I saw him, he completely vanished. I looked around me to see if maybe anyone else had seen it. But it was 5:50 a.m. at this point, so no one was in the store with me except for the cashier clerk. I gathered my courage and forced myself to walk to the bus stop. As I'm waiting for the bus to arrive, I again start to feel a shiver. Then my heartbeat quickened. I got up from the bench where I was waiting and started to look around but could not see anything. Then I swear as I took a breath, I heard a voice directly in my ear of a man say, "I'm sorry." As I'm typing this, I'm literally getting chills just remembering the sound of his voice. I instantly knew it was the figure I had seen in the parking lot. I stood there so freaked out, almost in tears when the bus finally came to my stop to get me. After this happened to me, I paid my friend to drive me to work for the next 2 months. When I was around 18 months old, my mom married my stepfather. I didn't remember a father in my life before him, so he has always been Dad. I was spoiled and indulged as a child, Even after the birth of my younger siblings, I was always Daddy's girl. I believe this was why it was such a shock to me when my paternal grandmother treated my mom and I like parasites. My paternal grandfather was gentle and attentive, without being as indulgent as my dad. I loved his teddy bear hugs and how he always smelled like cherry pipe tobacco. My grandmother was the skinny, sour-faced chain smoker that only moved from her chair to refill her coffee cup. My brothers and I knew, from very young, that once we arrived at our grandparents' house, we were to immediately go into the den and play quietly until it was time to leave. On a side note, even before my brothers were born, I would be dropped off in the den to play by myself. Quite often, the adults would hear me talking to myself, toddler babble with few understandable words, and come to check on me. When asked, I would simply tell them I was talking to the Indian. No one knew what to make of it, but I wasn't in the slightest bit upset, so they left me alone. Consequently, this made the den at the grandparents' sort of the safe place in the house. My mom even confirmed this to me a few years ago, saying it seemed to be the only bright spot in the whole house. However, there were times when you would have to venture out of that safe place to use the bathroom. It usually involved one of us timidly making our way out of the den, through the laundry room, and into the kitchen where the adults were talking. We'd stand in the archway between the dining room and the kitchen and wait to be noticed. It was nerve-wracking, knowing waiting too long would be disastrous. But walking through the house to get to the upstairs bathroom, unescorted, could get you in serious trouble. Here's where the first problem came in. The layout of the house was simple, but involved moving from the den, through the laundry room, and into the dining room. The feel of the dining room was intimidating for two reasons. My grandmother could see you, and there would always be a scowl of disapproval. Children were not meant to be seen unless she wanted you for something. You always felt like you were being stared down by something on the far side of the dining room. If you strayed too far into the dining room, there was a fear something would grab at you from under the heavy sideboard. Once we had Mom's attention, she would immediately get up from the table and take us to the bathroom. Here's where the second problem came in. You had to go through the living room to reach the stairs. Heavens help you if it was already dark outside, since my grandparents didn't believe in leaving a light on in any room if they weren't physically in the room. If you were lucky, they'd left the upstairs hallway light on, which meant the staircase was well lit. Even that short jaunt from dining room across the dark living room to the bottom of the stairs always made you feel like you were being chased. The relief of reaching the bathroom at the top of the stairs was twofold at that point. Now, for those of you chuckling and attributing it to a child's fear of the dark, you couldn't be more wrong. My mom agreed with me that she hated having to use the bathroom at my grandparents' house after dark because of the walk through the living room. She was usually grateful when one of us kids came to ask for a chaperone. This short walk done even during the day could be unnerving, as though you were being carefully watched and could be grabbed at any moment. This didn't go away as I got older either, but that explanation can wait a bit. Around the time I turned 6, my dad had a serious argument with his parents, though I wouldn't learn the content of the argument until long after both grandparents had passed away. 2 years later, my dad decided to try to mend fences and took us over to visit. It was a very long visit, as I recall. My dad was reluctant to leave, even after my brothers and I let my mom know we were tired. In a stroke of malice or a sincere attempt at civility, I have never been sure which, my grandmother told my mom to bring my brothers and I into the dining room and let us crash on the floor until my dad was ready to leave. She even busied herself bringing in several blankets and a few small throw pillows for us to sleep on. I remember being very nervous, since we were not only where grandmother could see us, but we were in close proximity to whatever it was that made us feel threatened in the dining room. My brothers curled up together close to the dining room table, where the feeling wasn't quite as strong. I was left asleep either facing or with my back to the sideboard, where I knew this entity crouched in waiting. I managed to lie there, staring at the ceiling and listening to the adults talk only a few feet away. I pointedly ignored the skin-crawling sensation of being very carefully studied and watched, as though the thing was trying to decide if I was the one it was after, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge what I saw as a dreadful challenge. I finally decided to put my back to the sideboard and cuddled up against my younger brother. Tired as I was, I managed to fall asleep despite the threat. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I felt my younger brother stiffen against me, and I managed to pry an eye open. His little face was a strange mix of half asleep and absolutely terrified, and he was staring at something over my shoulder. My stomach immediately started to churn, and I reached out to touch his side briefly to get his attention. His eyes slid to mine and then snapped back to whatever it was. As much as my brain screamed at me not to, I rolled to my opposite side and found myself staring into two bright red eyes. My heart began to race with my lungs as though trying to see who could escape first. Somewhere in the cacophony of blood pounding in my ears, I began to hear a low growl akin to the noise our German shepherd would make at any stray snakes in our backyard. Then I saw a brief flash of white, which my over-oxygenated brain said, teeth. I bolted upright, scooting back against my brother to push him out of the way of whatever it was, and screamed loud enough to bring the roof down. My mom told me later, I startled the adult so badly that my dad tipped over the chair he was sitting in, and my granddad nearly dropped his pipe. My mom came running in while I was in the process of trying to shove my brothers away from the dining room table and toward the archway to the den, the safe place. For a moment, and I'm still not sure I really saw it or not, there seemed to be a foggy figure of a man with dark hair standing in the archway. My beleaguered brain had me believing that if I managed to get my brothers to him, he would protect them from this demon. However, it turned into a non-issue with my mom arriving on the scene in a matter of heartbeats and pulling all three of us into her arms. At that point, Mom announced that we were going home. My brothers never slept at the grandparents' house again. However, my experiences in-house were far from over. The visits to the grandparents' house continued throughout my teen years, and I managed to never see the damned thing again. The constant battle of wills with the chaser in the dark corners of the living room was ongoing, but its interest seemed to fade as I aged. Either that, or it was slowly starting to realize I wasn't as afraid of it any longer. I would now boldly walk through the dark living room, even without the hall light, stand at the bottom of the stairs to flip the hall light on myself. I would make a show of me deliberately taking my time, not racing up the stairs. To anyone else, the show probably would have been extremely funny to witness, but my stubborn streak would no longer let me run from this thing. Then came a rough patch for my family. My granddad had a series of strokes that left him wheelchair-bound for nearly 2 years. Then after another massive stroke, he passed away. He was cremated, and his ashes were given to my dad, per his wishes. But this left my grandmother alone in the house. Suddenly, the house was too big for her, too quiet. I suspected she had started to experience things herself. For no reason I can understand, my mom and dad asked me to temporarily move in with her, to help keep an eye on her during the night. Whether it was the extra hour-and-a-half commute to school every morning, or the ridiculous amount of trigonometry homework I had, I operated in a sort of foggy haze that left me not noticing or caring about the odd things happening in the house. My schedule would put me on a bus at 6:15 a.m., pull through school and drama club until 6 p.m., be at my parents' house around 6:30 p.m. to have dinner, then be taken to my grandmother's house around 7:30 p.m. to finish my homework and sleep. If there had been anything paying attention, they would have noticed I had no energy for them to feed from. My mom and dad eventually convinced grandmother to sell her house and move in with us. The house was put on the market. Her things were moved into what amounted to a large walk-in closet of my parents' bedroom. For those thinking we stuck Granny in the closet, that wasn't the case. It was more of a small bedroom complete with a full window and plenty of room for a bed, dresser, and desk. However, it wasn't long before the diagnosis of COPD came in for grandmother. She was forced to try to quit smoking after 40-plus years. The medication they gave her and the process of her quitting tobacco was a terrible combination for grandmother. She suddenly started seeing things growing out of the walls which no one else could see, heard things no one else could hear, and would cry randomly. After speaking with her doctors, The recommendation was to move grandmother into a senior living environment where they could monitor her condition better. She stayed there a grand total of 3 weeks, announced she was done with my dad, and rented a mobile home. It was the last time I would ever see or speak her. 6 months later, she was found in her mobile home, apparently dead of a heart attack, by a neighbor who hadn't seen her outside in 2 days. According to her wishes, she was cremated and mixed with Granddad's ashes in the same urn. Those ashes would stay on the top of Mom's china cabinet for 3 years before being spread on a piece of family-owned land. Just before she passed away, the house finally sold to a couple from New Jersey with no children. Now, the only reason I mention that the couple was childless is due to a series of odd things which occurred in the years after they bought the house. My mom and dad were very friendly with the couple. I'll call them Ben and Allie for clarity's sake, and made sure to make themselves available if they had any questions about the house. During the transition period, Ben and Allie asked my dad about someone be able to house sit for their 2 dogs and 2 cats while they were finalizing the sale of their house in New Jersey. It would take about 2 weeks. Then there would be a second period of about a week during the closing. My dad, absolutely without my permission or knowledge, I would have said a hard no, volunteered me. At first I was simply annoyed because I wasn't asked. This was the summer between my senior year of high school and starting college in the fall. I was already working, really didn't want to have to adapt my schedule even further to take care of someone else's pets. After a day's conversation with my best friend, she pointed out 2 very important things to me. I'd have an entire house to myself, no one to determine my schedule other than work. They were paying a flat $500 for those 2 weeks in cash that would help toward the cost of college textbooks in the fall. I went to my dad that night with one reservation. I would be in that house alone. I accepted. Of course, I did my best not to dwell too much on my past experiences. I was introduced to Ben and Allie, shown the few changes they'd managed to make in 2 months within the house, and met the sweet furry critters, Alex and Duke, I'd be staying with for 2 weeks. I was given the far bedroom upstairs, which had been my youngest aunt's room in former days, and told to make myself at home. I waved goodbye from the front stoop, ushered the 2 dogs back into the house to refill their food dishes, and received sloppy kisses and thanks. The feline element of the family was much hesitant, but that wasn't what caught my attention. I noticed that the cats lay just inside the archway of the dining room, watching something in the living room rather intently. Knowing the history of the living room, I refused to be drawn into that conversation just yet. Instead, I followed the wagging tail train into the den. The den had been set up as more of a family room now, with a large sofa on one wall, a huge television on a stand in the alcove, where a chest freezer had been with a computer desk in one corner. Wonderfully comfortable and welcoming. It felt almost like I was being hugged as I stood in the middle of the room, as I smiled down at the 2 scoundrels drooling at my feet. I popped on the television and curled up on the couch with a furry body on both sides of me. It was almost 11:30 p.m. when I realized I should get some sleep. I did have work tomorrow after all. The minute I stepped from the den into the laundry room, it was as though I was stepping into a pressure cooker. Laundry room to dining room, the atmosphere was thick and soupy, like trying to breathe underwater. My stomach churned. I could smell something awful but had no idea where it was coming from. The elderly German shepherd, Duke, let out a low growl, but stopped still, finally turning around and going back into the den. He refused to leave the den unless it was to find food after that. The goofy golden lab, Alex, stood next to me, still looking into the dining room, watching something keenly. I decided I simply needed to push through this and try to act nonchalant. As I walked through the dining room into the living room, I was more than grateful that I left the hall light on for the stairs. Alex stayed so close to me that he bumped my leg with every step, but refused to let me go by myself. I cleared the stairs and made my way into the large back bedroom, Alex still carefully pacing behind me, but also glancing back through the railings down the stairs every few steps. I spoke to him softly, calling him a good dog. Even when we reached the room, he wouldn't go into the bedroom with me. Instead, he positioned his large frame on the floor in the door frame in watchdog mode. I got changed and laid down to sleep. fully knowing it would be a miracle if I got any sleep that night. I woke sometime in the early hours of the morning to the sound of Alex's low growls from the doorway. That oppressive atmosphere from the dining room had somehow seeped into the hallway right outside the door. As I sat up to try to remember where I was, Alex shot to his feet and started to growl louder. Then I heard Duke start barking from downstairs. Suddenly there was a crash from downstairs. It felt like every window in the house rattled. That's when Alex stopped growling and Duke's barking subsided. But there was a sudden sound of whispering voices. A male and female were tumbling over each other trying to talk. Pain bloomed behind my eyes. It felt like my head was coming apart. It was only a few seconds before a sparkle of light flashed at the sides of my eyes when I realized I wasn't breathing. I forced air into my lungs, and Alex came running into the room, nearly knocking me over trying to lick my face. The whispering retreated and I sat shaking, trying to slow my breathing into a normal rhythm. I had been crying, either out of fear or pain. I didn't know. But Alex wasn't leaving me alone until he knew I was safe. We stayed that way until I saw the first peaks of sunlight streaming through the curtains. I dressed while Alex sat in the doorway, patiently waiting for me. Whatever it had been had dissipated. I went into the bathroom to splash water on my face when consider whether I was conscious enough to attempt work that day. Alex sat post at the top of the stairs, staring down into the living room. Duke was laying stretched across the bottom landing, watching the cats roll around in the sunshine. My early warning system and those two guard dogs settled my nerves. I gave both lots of scratches and kisses before I left for the day. By the time I returned that afternoon, I had already decided I wasn't sleeping upstairs again that night. I grabbed my bag from the bedroom, showered quickly, and took everything, including a pillow and spare blanket from the bed, down to the den to bunked on the couch for the rest of the 2 weeks. When Ben and Allie returned, we caught up for a few minutes in the kitchen. They paid me and asked if I would be interested in staying again when they went back for the closing. As much as I loved my two furry protectors at that point, I wasn't sure I could handle another 2 weeks sleeping in that house. I sighed and told them to call me when they had a date. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I came down with strep throat and pneumonia only a few days before they were to leave, and I wasn't leaving my comfy bed when I felt so miserable. It was truly the last time I was ever in my grandparents' house. There were a series of small fires throughout the house that did some minor damage over the course of 2 years. Ben became very sick, complications with diabetes. Allie suffered a miscarriage after many years of trying to get pregnant. Duke passed away in the living room one night. They woke to Alex lying next to his friend, crying softly. Then a fire that started in an upstairs bedroom, which ended up claiming the whole house. It was chalked up to faulty wiring, but Allie confided to us that the bedroom hadn't been used at all. They used it solely for storage and couldn't understand how the fire had even started. A few years back, my mom was coming home after spending the afternoon at my aunt's home. When she got home, she told my husband and I about the incident she experienced while waiting for a bus. We come from a family of healers and sensitives, so I've had paranormal and supernatural experiences all my life, as has the rest of my family. My mom, although slightly skeptical and a bit reluctant to embrace the gifts our ancestors have passed down to us, has had her fair share of unexplained events in her own life. She told us that while waiting for the bus, she suddenly saw movement from the corner of her eye. As she looked across the road, she saw 3 teenagers. In usual circumstances, this wouldn't be out of the ordinary at all, as the shops are a regular meeting place for all the local teens. However, there was something slightly odd with these young people. My mom said they were dressed in clothing from the 70s, which she recognizes from her young teenage years. People were walking around them, but no one was acknowledging their presence, their existence totally overlooking their presence, as if they were invisible to the passers-by. My mom's attention was distracted for a brief moment. When she looked back again to the area the teenagers were at, they were gone. She even watched the only open shop, as she thought they might have gone in there. She waited until her bus came, 20 minutes later, but they never came out. There was nowhere else they could have gone in that time frame when my mom wasn't watching them. She said the most unsettling thing about it was the normality of the three figures. They looked as real as can be. The fact that she was the only one to see them was such a surprise to her. After this experience, she slowly started to believe more in her abilities to see the paranormal. Thanks for tuning in. Watch another video if you dare.